Introduction to Philosophy, Lecture 6, on Reality and Knowledge. Chapter 6 picks up on Hume's Enquiry concerning human understanding, with emphasis on skepticism. David Hume is a philosopher who should not be underestimated. He makes some people intellectually frustrated and others completely furious. Despite writing in the 1700s, most of his work is still highly influential, and some of it remains undefeated. For example, depending on the approach to scientific method you employ, the problem of induction will pose a deep fundamental problem for your whole method of inquiry. If you believe scientific methods provide positive conclusions, that is to say, they give us knowledge of what is, or what will happen as a consequence of something else. That is, if you conduct experiments and conclude that the results say something about what will happen in the future, which would be inductive, then you're arguing that the future will resemble the past because the future resembles the past, which is, of course, circular, or a begging the question fallacy. Unless your approach to scientific method is completely negative, as argued by Karl Popper, that is to say, science is only in the business of disproving things. If the results of experiments are only intended to tell us what didn't happen, then they'd be deductive and not circular. However, this has disturbing consequences, one of which is quite fundamental, that is, science is supposed to be a way to acquire truth. However, on this view, science can only tell us what isn't the case, or isn't the truth, which in a sense doesn't really provide us the truth as we want it, but only elucidates what is false. Another issue that Hume is credited with discovering is the so-called fact-value dichotomy, or the is-ought gap. It is remarkable that between Aristotle and Hume over 2,000 years, no one ever noticed or picked up on this one. In simple terms, the is-ought gap can be described as follows. Just because something is a certain way, it doesn't follow that it ought to be that way. To understand why the is-ought gap is difficult to pick up on, consider these examples. Example 1. This flower is growing in the field, so it ought to be growing in the field. It is not obvious that this is incorrect, even though it does commit the appeal to nature fallacy, which states that if something is natural, then it is morally acceptable. Example 2. This baby is playing on the floor, so it ought to be playing on the floor. Here again, the problem isn't obvious, just like in the first example. Now consider this third example. Hitler is killing millions, so he ought to be killing millions. Just like in the first two examples, it does not follow from the fact that something is, that it ought to be that way. But to digress, Hume was highly influential, and just like all of the thinkers we will discuss in this course, further research is highly recommended, especially if you're going to be studying philosophy at a university or considering becoming a philosophy major. Our selection from Hume's Enquiry concerning human understanding begins with Hume pointing out that at the time, some of the most notable philosophers were arguing for the existence of God, purporting to prove God's existence, while at the same time arguing about whether anyone could be stupid enough to be an atheist. He contrasts these observations with fictional knights who wandered the land to eradicate dragons and giants, who never entertained the idea that dragons and giants might not exist. So Hume seems to be pointing out how peculiar it is that all of these religious philosophers were arguing for the existence of God when no one was challenging that idea at the time. The second paragraph introduces the concept of skepticism. The third paragraph introduces Cartesian doubt, as discussed in the last lecture. According to Hume, the extreme methodological skepticism of Descartes, which depends on universal doubt, is not only impossible to attain outside of these thought experiments, but would also be incurable if it were ever attained. Hume also doesn't buy Descartes' cogito argument as a starting point for discovering truth and knowledge, since, from his point of view, we couldn't advance a single step beyond it without employing the same faculties we are supposed to be doubting. Therefore, Cartesian doubt cannot bring us to the assurance and certainty that it seeks. However, in the fourth paragraph, Hume admits a more moderate version of Descartes' skepticism is beneficial for achieving and preserving a level of impartiality in our reasoning. By implementing a more moderate skepticism, we can check our preconceived notions, prejudices, and perhaps even mistaken beliefs. It's not that Hume thinks Descartes' project of working from certain principles as a starting point to acquire knowledge is completely mistaken. It's that the nature of the skepticism Descartes employs is too extreme for the project to get off the ground. Indeed, as Hume says, to begin with clear and self-evident principles, to advance by timorous, sure steps, to review frequently our conclusions, and examine accurately all of their consequences, though by these means we shall make both slow and short progress in our systems, are the only methods by which we can ever hope to reach truth and attain a proper stability and certainty in our determinations. The fifth paragraph of our selection contrasts Descartes' methodological skepticism, which he referred to as antecedent, that is, before the consequent of philosophy, in a conditional relationship with a second type of skepticism that is consequent to science. In science, we observe the world as though facts of the world are discoverable to us through our senses. In examining the world through our senses, we notice that our senses at times deceive us. However, as Hume points out in paragraph 6, these errors in our perceptions do not completely discredit our senses. It just means that, at times, our sense data need to be corrected by reason. Hume briefly points out in paragraphs 7 and 8 that humans and animals are naturally inclined to trust their senses and assume that they perceive a world, external to themselves, that exists independently of our existence and will persist in existing after our deaths. In paragraph 9, Hume explains that this natural and almost universal trust in our sense perceptions and belief in the external world and its objects is challenged by philosophers who argue that our minds do not have direct access to the objects of the external world, and, therefore, we can only be certain of our perceptions of the world. A simple way to understand this is to consider the appearance of the world through our human eyes, and to contrast that with how we think the world appears through dog eyes. Though the dog and I are looking at the same object, the images that we receive in our minds from the photons that are transduced through our retinas to our brains after bouncing off the object we are looking at will be different because our eyes are different. Therefore, in sense perception, we can only know objects as they are to us, through our own veil of perception, as it is called. We cannot know the objects directly, or at least any more directly than that. In paragraph 10, Hume does a very poor job of explaining a paradox that emerges from the disagreement between the beliefs of the philosophers just discussed and the general belief in the existence of an external world. What Hume seems to be saying is, in recognizing that our access to the external world involves a filtering through the kind of sense organs that we have, reason dictates that we take a skeptical approach to our sense experiences. So, we replace the natural system of understanding the world through our senses, which have been shown to be fallible, with a system that depends on the a posteriori knowledge of the world that we are skeptical of, and the a priori knowledge of logical, mathematical, and geometric principles. But how are we supposed to apply the favored a priori knowledge to the fallible a posteriori data in a way that it can produce reliable conclusions? This would, in Hume's terms, exceed the power of human capacity, since, and I'm guessing here, we can only reason about questionable sense data. The 11th paragraph complicates things further, since Hume points out that some philosophers argue that the mind creates the perceptions we have of the world rather than the world being perceived by the mind. Worse still, philosophers acknowledge, Descartes among them, that many of these perceptions are completely mistaken as those in dreams, madness, and disease. Even more remarkable still, to Hume, that the body can operate on the mind such that it can convey an image of itself to the mind, which is supposed to be a completely different substance from itself. In paragraph 12, Hume seems to be addressing the question of whether perceptions of our senses are caused by external objects in the world. He argues that this question can only be answered by experience. However, he contends that our experience can never provide us with the evidence of the connection between our perceptions and the external objects that cause them. This is because all we ever have access to is our perceptions, and we cannot experience the connection between these perceptions and the objects in the world. According to Hume, the idea of such a connection is therefore not supported by any reasoning or evidence. As Hume continues into paragraph 13, he really seems to be giving Descartes a run for his money, though it is hard to say since he's so terrible at explaining himself. As an aside, this is a trend that would unfortunately continue through the next era of philosophy. That is, from Hume to Kant and from Kant to Hegel, late modern philosophy would become continually more and more profound and more confusing. It's almost as though, in the late modern era, the less people could understand what you were saying, the more impressive you were as a philosopher. In paragraph 13, Hume argues against the approach of appealing to the existence of a God to prove the reliability of our senses. He believes that if God existed and was truthful, then our senses would always be accurate. However, if God existed, we wouldn't be able to use his existence as evidence, since it would require proving the existence of God and his attributes first. Basically, trying to prove the accuracy of our senses by invoking the existence of a supreme being is a roundabout and unnecessary way of approaching the issue. What Hume seems to be saying in paragraph 14 is that the most philosophical skeptics always appear irrefutable when they try to bring doubt into all areas of human knowledge and inquiry. If you rely on your senses and natural instincts, then you may believe that what you sense is the actual object. But if you reject this idea in favor of the idea that what you sense is just a representation of something external, then you're going against your instincts and can't find any proof from experience that what you sense is connected to an external object. Your reason will never be able to find a convincing argument for this. In paragraph 15, Hume is discussing the philosophical idea that all of the qualities of objects, such as hardness, softness, heat, cold, color, etc., are only in the mind and not actually in the objects themselves. He argues that if this is true for the secondary qualities, it must also be true for the supposed primary qualities of extension and solidity. He says that the idea of extension is only based on what we see and touch, and if all qualities perceived by our senses are only in our mind, then the same must be true for extension. He points out that the only way to avoid this conclusion is to say that the ideas of primary qualities are gained through abstraction, but he says that this is unintelligible and absurd. He uses the example of trying to imagine a triangle in general to illustrate this absurdity of ideas. In paragraph 16, Hume is stating that there are two philosophical objections to the idea that our senses accurately reflect the external world. The first objection is that the belief in the accuracy of our senses is based on our natural instincts, contradicts reason, and if based on reason, contradicts our natural instincts. Additionally, there is no rational evidence that can convince a neutral observer. The second objection goes further and says that the belief in the accuracy of our senses is contrary to reason. This is because, if it is a principle of reason that all sensory qualities exist only in the mind and not in the objects themselves, then when we remove all the sensory qualities from matter, we essentially destroy it, leaving only a vague and inexplicable cause of our perceptions. This idea is considered so imperfect that even skeptics would not waste their time trying to argue against it. All in all, David Hume's work, An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, challenges the traditional views of philosophers on the existence of God and the acquisition of knowledge and truth. He critiques the radical form of skepticism practiced by Descartes, and instead advocates for a moderate skepticism to maintain impartiality in reasoning. Hume highlights the limitations of our sense perception and the challenges that arise when trying to reconcile our belief in the external world and our skepticism of our sense experiences. He also acknowledges the philosophical debates on the nature of perception and the mind's role in creating it. Despite the difficulty in reading and comprehending his ideas, Hume's philosophical inquiry provides valuable insights into the limitations of human understanding and the methods by which we can strive towards truth and certainty.